The cold accusation hung in the air of Damien Falcone's study, as heavy and suffocating as the scent of old leather and cigar smoke. Clara stood on the Persian rug, her small frame swallowed by the cavernous room lined with books she would never read. Before her, on the polished mahogany desk, lay his late wife's watch, its diamond-encrusted face glittering cruelly under the lamplight. It was a sacred relic in this house, and she was being accused of stealing it. One of Falcone's most trusted men presented the evidence, his voice a low, respectful drone of damnation. Her soft denials were lost, a whisper against the contemptuous silence of the other guards in the room. Her gaze, however, was fixed on the man in the high-backed chair, the one who had yet to speak. His silence was the only thing that mattered. But the truth of what happened in that chillingly silent mansion was a secret only a child knew. And if you stay with this story until the very end, that secret will change everything you think you know about justice and redemption. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments what you would do in her place. Clara, at 24, was a nursing student who moved through life with the quiet determination of someone who had learned early on that the world did not grant favors. Her days were a carefully balanced equation of lectures, late-night study sessions fueled by cheap coffee, and the long hours she spent working as a nanny in the Falcone home. She carried the weight of her family's past, a sudden illness, a mountain of debt, like a second skin, a constant reminder of why she could not afford to fail, to misstep, to be seen. Her integrity was her only real possession, a fragile shield she held up against a world that seemed determined to grind her down. She was honest not by choice, but by necessity. It was the one thing no one could take from her. Her existence within the imposing Chicago mansion was one of ghosts and echoes. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the endless marble floors as she moved from the sterile, modern kitchen to the somber, quiet rooms of the second floor. She cared for Leo, Damien Falcone's withdrawn 6-year-old son, in a nursery that felt more like a museum exhibit than a child's bedroom. The house itself was a character in her life, a gilded cage of oppressive silence, where sunlight struggled to pierce through thick velvet curtains, and the air was always still, heavy with unspoken histories and the constant unnerving presence of men with secrets in their eyes and weapons concealed beneath tailored suits. The pressure on her was a constant low hum of anxiety. It was in the sharp, dismissive tone of the head housekeeper, who viewed her as a temporary inconvenience. It was in the cold, assessing gazes of the security detail that followed her every move through hidden cameras. Most of all, it was in the crushing responsibility she felt for her younger sister's college tuition, a promise made at their mother's bedside. This job, with its generous pay and suffocating rules, was her only means of keeping that promise. She felt like a ghost haunting someone else's opulent tragedy, her own life held in suspense, invisible to the powerful figures who controlled her fate. Her sharp sense of justice was a quiet rebellion. She saw the casual cruelty of the world from a vantage point of powerlessness, and it hardened something deep inside her. As a child, she had watched her father lose his small business to a man with better lawyers and fewer morals, a memory that left an indelible mark on her soul. Now, surrounded by the immense, untouchable power of Damien Falcone, she saw the same dynamic on a grander scale. She didn't covet their wealth. She resented the impunity it afforded them. Her empathy, especially for young Leo, who was as much a prisoner in this house as she was, became her silent defiance against the coldness that permeated its walls. That evening, a subtle dissonance had settled over the mansion long before she was summoned. A nervous energy vibrated through the halls, a tension that even the thick carpets couldn't absorb. The usual quiet felt different. It was not peaceful, but predatory. She noticed the head of security, a man named Marco, watching her from the end of a corridor, his expression unreadable but sharp, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. A scheduled delivery had been abruptly canceled. A heavy vase in the foyer was slightly out of place, These were small, insignificant details on their own, but together they wove a tapestry of wrongness, a premonition that the fragile piece of her routine was about to be irrevocably shattered. The summons came as a polite, chilling request delivered by a guard whose face remained a stoic mask. "Mr. Falcone would like to see you in his study, miss." The walk down the long, shadowed hallway felt like a mile. Each step echoed with a finality she couldn't comprehend. The portraits of Falcone ancestors seemed to watch her with accusatory eyes, their painted faces stern and unforgiving. She reached the massive oak door and hesitated, her hand trembling as she raised it to knock. Behind that door was a silence that held the power of a verdict, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was about to be judged for a crime she did not commit. Her world was a study in gray, beginning before the Chicago dawn had a chance to bleed color into the sky. The small third-floor apartment she shared with a roommate was a cramped space of second-hand furniture and the lingering scent of her neighbor's fried onions. Clara's morning ritual was a silent, practiced ballet of efficiency. She'd slip into her simple, dark blue uniform, a garment that felt more like a costume for a role she never auditioned for, erasing her identity and marking her as staff. As she pinned her hair back, her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed a face etched with a tiredness that sleep could not remedy. It was the weariness of a life lived on a razor's edge, where one wrong move, one unexpected expense, could send everything tumbling into ruin. The journey to the Falcone estate was a descent into another reality, a 45-minute bus ride that ferried her from the grit of her neighborhood to the manicured perfection of theirs. Pressed against the cold glass, she watched the city transform, the graffiti-covered brick giving way to pristine brownstones and then finally to the sprawling, gated fortresses of the city's elite. The bus was always packed, a microcosm of weary travelers, each lost in their own struggle. For Clara, it was a time for silent calculation, tuition payments, grocery bills, the rising cost of her sister's textbooks. Each dollar was a soldier she had to deploy with strategic precision in a war against impending financial collapse, a battle she fought alone. Stepping through the wrought iron gates of the Falcone property was like passing through a membrane into a world devoid of sound and warmth. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, was her immediate superior and a constant source of low-grade oppression. Gable's inspections were meticulous and her corrections delivered in a clipped, condescending tone that made Clara feel perpetually incompetent. Her job was to care for Leo, but her presence was policed by a set of unwritten rules. Never speak unless spoken to, never linger in the main rooms, and never, under any circumstances, draw the attention of Damien Falcone. She was paid to be a caregiver, but treated like a necessary and untrustworthy piece of furniture. Her life became a carefully partitioned existence. During the day, she was the quiet, efficient nanny, moving through the cavernous mansion with a practiced invisibility. She would read to Leo in a soft voice, her nursing instincts kicking in as she monitored his fragile health and tried to coax a smile from his serious, watchful eyes. But at night, back in her cramped room, she would pull out her medical textbooks, the complex diagrams and Latin terms, a lifeline to a future she desperately wanted. She dreamt of healing, of providing comfort, of a life where her worth was measured not by her silence and obedience, but by her skill and compassion. This quiet ambition was her most guarded secret, a fragile flame she protected from the chilling drafts of her reality. The only true light in that oppressive gloom was Leo. The boy was a silent observer, much like his father, but in his eyes Clara saw not coldness, but a profound loneliness that mirrored her own. She discovered he loved stories about constellations, so she'd spend her evenings memorizing star charts to share with him. She learned that the scent of lavender calmed his anxieties, so she'd tuck a small sachet into his pillowcase. These were small, quiet acts of rebellion against the house's sterile atmosphere. In caring for him, she found a purpose that transcended the paycheck. He was not just her charge. He was the one person in that entire fortress who saw her as a human being, and she, in turn, saw the vulnerable child hidden behind the Falcone name. The pressure mounted with a call from her younger sister, her voice a mix of excitement about her classes and thinly veiled worry about the upcoming tuition deadline. Clara assured her everything was under control, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. The truth was, she was barely keeping her head above water. The weight of that promise made to her dying mother was a physical ache in her chest. She had to succeed. She had to provide. This job, this gilded prison, was the only thing standing between her sister's future and the same cycle of debt and struggle that had defined her own life. Failure was not an option she could afford, making her vulnerable to the whims of the powerful people who signed her checks. Her resentment of that power was rooted in a past she rarely spoke of. She remembered the day her father came home, his face pale and defeated after losing his small hardware store to a predatory competitor who had buried him in legal fees he couldn't afford. She remembered the look in his eyes, the shame of a good man broken by a rigged system. Now, living in the Falcone mansion, she was surrounded by the very essence of that untouchable power. It was in the casual way large sums of money were discussed, in the deference shown by city officials who visited, and in the cold, hard certainty that these men operate under a different set of rules. This wasn't just a job, it was a daily confrontation with the injustice that had shattered her family. That afternoon, the house felt different. A palpable tension coiled in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara noticed Mrs. Gable speaking in hushed, agitated tones on the phone, her face pinched with an unusual stress. Later, while tidying the family room, she saw that a heavy crystal decanter on a side table was misaligned, a detail so minor no one else would notice, but it snagged at her attention. It was a disruption in the mansion's perfect, oppressive order. A premonition whispered through her, a cold finger tracing its way down her spine. Something was wrong. The carefully maintained facade of the Falcone home was cracking, and she felt a terrifying certainty that she was standing directly on the fault line. The moment of humiliation came not from Falcone, but from his trusted head of security, Marco. As she was preparing Leo's afternoon snack in the kitchen, he entered, flanked by two other guards. He stopped and stared at the simple silver locket she wore, a worn keepsake from her mother. "Is that new?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual but laced with accusation. Clara's blood ran cold. She explained it was a family heirloom, her voice barely a whisper. He smirked, a cruel, knowing look that stripped her of all dignity. "Just be careful with what belongs to you," he said, "and what doesn't." The other guard snickered. In that moment, she was branded a potential thief, her character assassinated in the sterile silence of the kitchen. Less than an hour later, the summons arrived. A guard, his face an impassive granite mask, found her in the nursery reading to Leo. "Mr. Falcone will see you in his study, now." The word hung in the air, a command, not a request. He waited as she gently closed the book, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The walk down the long, art-lined hallway was a walk toward a guillotine. Each step on the plush runner muffled the sound of her own doom approaching. She could feel the weight of every portrait's gaze, every shadow a potential accuser. She reached the imposing oak doors of the study, the place she had been ordered never to enter, and knew with a sickening certainty that the vague, oppressive threat that had haunted her for months was about to become terrifyingly real. The heavy oak door opened not with a creak, but with a deep, resonant sigh, as if the house itself were exhaling. The study was a sanctuary of shadows and secrets, paneled in dark wood that seemed to drink the light from the single desk lamp. Shelves of leather-bound books climbed to the ceiling, their spines like silent, judging witnesses. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, expensive whiskey, and the faint, lingering ghost of cigar smoke. In the center of this domain, behind a desk as vast and polished as a black mirror, sat Damien Falcone. He was a figure carved from the very shadows that surrounded him, a man whose stillness was more commanding than any movement. His presence was a physical weight in the room, a silent gravitational pull that bent everything toward him. He was dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the dim light, tailored with a precision that spoke of immense wealth and discipline. His hands rested on the arms of his high-backed leather chair, perfectly still, betraying no emotion. He wasn't looking at her as she entered, but at the city lights glittering beyond the bulletproof window behind him. A kingdom of glass and steel he surveyed with the cool detachment of a monarch. Yet Clara felt his awareness of her as a tangible force, a cold current in the air. He was a man who saw everything without needing to look, whose power was so absolute it required no demonstration. The respectful silence of the other men in the room, his men, was a testament to the fear he commanded without a single word. Marco, the head of security, stepped forward, his voice a low, deferential rumble that was somehow more damning than a shout. He placed the object on the polished wood of the desk, his late watch. The diamonds on its face caught the lamplight, scattering cruel, brilliant sparks across the room. "We found it in her locker, sir, tucked away in a scarf." The lie was delivered with practiced ease, a performance for an audience of one. The other guards shifted, their expressions a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. The evidence was presented, the narrative set. Clara was a common thief, a footnote in the grand, violent history of this house, her fate now resting in the hands of the silent man in the chair. Clara's denial was a breath, a whisper lost in the suffocating silence. "I didn't take it." Her voice was small but steady, a fragile thread of truth in a room woven with deceit. She did not look at Marco or the other guards. Her gaze, wide with a fear she refused to let consume her, was locked on Damien Falcone. It was an appeal not to a judge, but to a man she instinctively knew was the only one who mattered. She willed him to see past the performance, to see the honesty she wore like a second skin. In her world, the truth was supposed to be a shield. Here, in his world, she was beginning to understand that the truth was whatever the most powerful person in the room decided it was. Damien Falcone finally turned his head, his movement slow and deliberate. His eyes, the color of storm clouds over a winter lake, settled on her. He didn't look at her with the contempt of his men, but with a cold, unnerving curiosity, like a scientist studying a strange new specimen. He saw her trembling, the slight tremor in her hands she tried to hide. But he also saw the unbroken line of her gaze, the quiet defiance that refused to shatter under the weight of his power. He saw an integrity that was so out of place in his world, it was almost a foreign language. For a flicker of a moment, his expression shifted, the dispassionate analysis giving way to something unreadable, something that was almost recognition. His gaze drifted from her face to the glittering watch on his desk. For an instant, the mask of cold control slipped. A shadow of profound, ancient pain passed through his eyes as he looked at the timepiece, the last tangible piece of a life that had been violently stolen from him. It wasn't just an object of value, it was a sacred relic, a testament to a love and a loss that defined the man he had become. The accusation of its theft was not about money, it was about the desecration of a memory. He looked back at Clara, and the coldness in his eyes was now laced with the chilling finality of a man whose deepest wound had been touched. His silence was the drawing of a breath before a verdict. But before that verdict could be rendered, the heavy study door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that shattered the room's oppressive stillness. Little Leo stood in the doorway, his small frame trembling, his face streaked with tears. He was clutching a blue EpiPen in his hand like a talisman. He ignored the armed guards and the suffocating tension, his eyes searching for only one person. "Clara," he sobbed, his voice raw with panic and relief. He ran across the vast Persian rug, his small feet stumbling, and threw himself against her, burying his face in her uniform as if she were the only safe harbor in a terrifying storm. The boy's words came out in a frantic, hiccuping rush, a story of childhood misadventure turned near tragedy. He had found a box of cookies in a pantry, not knowing they contained peanuts. He described the sudden tightness in his throat, the difficulty breathing, the sheer panic. The other staff had frozen, unsure what to do. But Clara, he explained, had been calm. She had recognized the signs of anaphylaxis immediately, her nursing training taking over. She had located his emergency kit, administered the injection with a steady hand, and talked to him in a soothing voice until his breathing eased. The watch, he confessed through his sobs, had been on the table next to him. In his panicked struggle for air, he had knocked it to the floor. As Leo spoke, the entire dynamic of the room shifted. The accusation evaporated, replaced by a truth so pure and undeniable it left no room for doubt. Damien Falcone watched his son cling to the young woman he was about to condemn. He saw not a thief, but a savior. He saw the person who, while his own highly paid, heavily armed men stood by, had possessed the knowledge and the courage to save his son's life. The ice in his gaze didn't just crack, it shattered. For the first time, he saw Clara not as an employee or a suspect, but as the quiet, unassuming guardian of the only thing in his dark world that was truly priceless. With a single, almost imperceptible lift of his hand, Damien silenced Marco, who had started to stammer an apology. The gesture was small, but carried the absolute authority of a king dismissing his court. One by one, the guards filed out of the room, their earlier arrogance replaced by a chastened unease. They left the door open behind them, but no one moved. The silence that descended now was different. It was no longer cold and accusatory, but thick with unspoken meaning, charged with the energy of a debt that could never be repaid. He and Clara were alone with the sleeping boy, caught in the quiet aftermath of a storm, the world outside the study having ceased to exist. The heavy silence in the study settled around them, a new kind of quiet, thick with unspoken gratitude and a debt that had no name. Damien Falcone finally moved, his motion fluid and controlled as he walked around the massive desk. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze dropping to his son, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms, his small body completely trusting. "He is safe because of you," Damien said, his voice a low, gravelly sound, stripped of its usual command and holding a raw, unfamiliar edge. It wasn't an apology for the accusation, but something far more profound, an acknowledgement. He saw her, truly saw her, for the very first time, and the weight of that look was both a shield and a cage. With a single, almost imperceptible lift of his hand, Damien silenced Marco, who had started to stammer an apology. The gesture was small, but carried the absolute authority of a king dismissing his court. One by one, the guards filed out of the room, their earlier arrogance replaced by a chastened unease. They left the door open behind them, but no one moved. The silence that descended now was different. It was no longer cold and accusatory, but thick with unspoken meaning, charged with the energy of a debt that could never be repaid. He and Clara were alone with the sleeping boy, caught in the quiet aftermath of a storm, the world outside the study having ceased to exist. The heavy silence in the study settled around them, a new kind of quiet, thick with unspoken gratitude and a debt that had no name. Damien Falcone finally moved, his motion fluid and controlled as he walked around the massive desk. He stopped a few feet from her, his son who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms, his small body completely trusting. "He is safe because of you," Damien said, his voice a low, gravelly sound, stripped of its usual command and holding a raw, unfamiliar edge. It wasn't an apology for the accusation, but something far more profound. He saw her, truly saw her. His gaze was both a shield and a cage. Clara wanted to retreat, to shrink back into the invisibility she had so carefully cultivated within these walls. But with Leo in her arms, she was anchored to the spot, a sudden, unwilling focal point in this powerful man's universe. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He made a gesture toward the door, a silent instruction for her to take Leo back to his room. As she passed him, the fabric of his suit jacket brushed against her arm, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through her system, a spark of warmth in the chilling opulence of the mansion. The breeze touch was an accident, yet it felt like a brand, a claim she didn't understand and desperately wanted to escape. In the days that followed, the mansion's atmosphere shifted. The oppressive scrutiny of the staff was replaced by a wary, almost fearful respect. Mrs. Gable no longer found fault in her work, and Marco, the head of security, now avoided her gaze entirely, his earlier arrogance replaced by a sullen, resentful silence. But the most significant change was Damien Falcone himself. He became a ghost in her periphery, a silent, watchful presence she would sense before she saw. She would be in the garden with Leo, pointing out a ladybug on a rose petal, and feel a prickling on the back of her neck, only to glance up at the study window and see a dark silhouette disappear from view. He was always there, a shadow she could not shake. She tried to maintain her distance, to rebuild the professional walls that had been shattered in his study. She focused on Leo, on her nursing books at night, on the routine that had once been her shield. But Damien's world kept bleeding into hers. One evening, as she was leaving, a sleek black car pulled up beside her at the gates, the window gliding down to reveal him in the back seat. "It's late. My driver will take you home," he stated, not asked. She politely refused, insisting the bus was fine, her independence a fragile armor she refused to shed. He didn't argue, but his eyes, dark and intense in the glow of the dashboard lights, held a flicker of something she couldn't name. Frustration, or perhaps a reluctant respect. The encounters grew more frequent, more deliberate. He began taking his evening coffee in the library at the same time she was reading a bedtime story to Leo in the adjoining sunroom. He would sit in a wingback chair, a book open but unread on his lap, the silence between the rooms broken only by the soft cadence of her voice. She was acutely aware of him listening, of his stillness on the other side of the glass doors. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her quiet compassion, her gentleness with his son being dissected and analyzed by a man who dealt in violence and fear. The contrast was a chasm between them, yet she felt an invisible thread being woven across it, pulling tighter with each shared silence. She began to see the cracks in his formidable facade. She saw the way his shoulders tensed when he received a certain phone call, the flash of weary pain in his eyes when he looked at a photograph of his late wife on the mantelpiece. One afternoon, she found him in the nursery, standing over Leo's bed, his large hand hovering just above his son's hair, hesitant to touch, as if he feared his own darkness might contaminate his child's innocence. In that unguarded moment, she saw not a monster, but a man haunted by grief and imprisoned by the very power he commanded. The fear she felt for him began to mingle with a dangerous, unwelcome flicker of empathy. He, in turn, was becoming undone by her. Her simple, unwavering moral compass was a phenomenon he no longer believed existed. He watched her on the security monitors, a habit he developed, not to police her, but to observe a creature from another world. He saw her return a wallet dropped by a delivery man, saw her give half her lunch to a stray cat at the gates, saw her sit patiently for an hour coaxing a splinter from Leo's finger. These small acts of unrewarded kindness were a language he had long forgotten. She was a quiet, steady light in the suffocating darkness of his life, and he found himself drawn to her warmth, even as he knew he was the very thing that could extinguish it. His control, the bedrock of his empire and his survival, was beginning to fracture. During a tense negotiation with a rival faction, his mind drifted to the sound of her laughter as she and Leo built a pillow fort in the living room. The memory was so vivid, so out of place in the sterile, hostile environment of the meeting, that he missed a crucial detail in the conversation. His second-in-command shot him a concerned look. Damien's focus, once a laser, was now split. He was fighting a war on two fronts, one in the city's underworld and a far more dangerous one inside himself, against a vulnerability he could not acknowledge. The tension finally found a physical outlet, as inevitable as a storm breaking. Clara was reaching for a book on a high shelf in the library, her fingers just brushing the spine, when another larger hand closed over hers, steadying the volume. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Damien stood behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He hadn't made a sound. He simply took the book and handed it to her, their fingers brushing again. The touch was electric, a silent explosion in the stillness of the room. Neither of them moved, caught in a moment suspended outside of time, the scent of old books and his expensive cologne filling her senses. Their eyes met, and the air crackled with everything left unsaid. Her fear, his loneliness, their shared concern for Leo, the violent chasm between their worlds, it all existed in that single, prolonged gaze. He saw not just her fear, but her strength, the quiet defiance that had captivated him from the start. She saw not the feared Mafia boss, but the profound sadness in his eyes, a deep, ancient wound that no amount of power or money could heal. It was a moment of dangerous, terrifying intimacy, more revealing than any conversation. He broke the contact first, his jaw tightening as he stepped back, retreating behind his impenetrable mask. Clara was left trembling, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The illusion of normalcy was shattered a week later. As Clara walked the few blocks from the bus stop to her apartment, the familiar city sounds seemed to fade, replaced by the low, menacing hum of a car engine pacing her from across the street. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows, a predator stalking its prey. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. She quickened her pace, her keys clutched in her hand like a weapon, the metallic edges digging into her palm. The car mirrored her movements, a silent, ominous shadow that confirmed her deepest fear. His world was now her world, and its dangers were hunting her. She fumbled with the lock to her apartment building, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key. The sedan slowed to a stop just down the street, its engine a soft, purring threat. She finally managed to open the door and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind her and leaning against it, her body trembling with adrenaline and terror. She was no longer just a nanny. She was a liability, a vulnerability. Her connection to Damien Falcone, a bond she never sought, had painted a target on her back. The safety of her simple, ordinary life was gone, replaced by the chilling certainty that she was being watched by his enemies. That night, sleep offered no escape. Every creak of the old building, every siren in the distance, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She felt trapped, not in her small apartment, but in a life that was no longer her own. The protection Damien offered was not a choice, it was a consequence. To be shielded by him was to be drawn deeper into the very darkness she feared. It was a gilded cage, and the bars were closing in around her. She stared into the darkness of her room, feeling utterly, terrifyingly alone, caught between a world that wanted to crush her and a man whose protection might be the most dangerous thing of all. A soft, insistent knock on her apartment door ripped through the silence just after midnight. Her heart leaped into her throat. It couldn't be her roommate, she was out of town. The sedan, the feeling of being watched, it all crashed down on her. She crept to the door, her body rigid with fear, and peered through the peephole. The hallway was dimly lit, but the figure standing there was unmistakable. It was Damien Falcone. He was alone, dressed in a dark overcoat, his shoulders tense, his face a mask of grim determination carved from the shadows. He wasn't looking at the door, but scanning the empty hallway, a sentinel standing guard. Her fear did not subside, it transformed. The terror of the unknown was replaced by the terrifying certainty of his presence. He had followed her. He knew. He had brought his darkness right to her doorstep. She slowly unlatched the deadbolt, the click echoing in the silent apartment like a gunshot. She opened the door just a crack, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge. He finally turned to look at her, and the cold fury in his eyes was not directed at her, but at the world outside, at the threat that had dared to touch her. "You are not safe here anymore," he said, his voice low and final. It was not a question or a warning. It was a verdict. The statement hung in the air between them, an undeniable truth that sealed her fate. His protection was no longer a subtle, watchful presence from afar. It was here, a tangible force in her hallway, demanding she make a choice that was no choice at all. Stepping into his world was terrifying, but staying in hers was now a death sentence. He had crossed a line, leaving the confines of his mansion and entering her small, fragile existence. In doing so, he was offering her the only sanctuary he knew how to provide, himself. And in the depths of his stormy eyes, she saw the terrible, binding promise that he would burn the world down before he let anyone hurt her. He didn't wait for an answer. He simply looked at her, his expression a complex mixture of grim resolve and a strange, protective tenderness that was more disarming. "Pack a bag," he commanded softly, the order laced with an urgency that left no room for argument. This was the ultimate transgression, the final collision of their worlds. He was not just protecting her, he was claiming her, pulling her from the life she knew and into the heart of his dangerous empire. She stood there, frozen in the doorway, realizing that the greatest danger wasn't the men who followed her in the shadows, but the man who had just stepped out of them to save her. The ride was a journey through a silent, suffocating void. Clara sat in the passenger seat of his car, a black machine that sliced through the Chicago night with predatory grace. Her small overnight bag a pathetic symbol of the life she had just been forced to abandon. The city lights smeared past the tinted windows, a world she could see but no longer belonged to. She stared straight ahead, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Damien drove with a focused, grim intensity, his own knuckles stark against the lever of the steering wheel. The only sounds were the soft hum of the engine and the frantic, silent scream inside her own head. Each passing mile felt like a link in a chain, pulling her deeper into his darkness, further away from herself. They did not go to the imposing fortress of his mansion. Instead, he navigated the car into the subterranean garage of a sleek, anonymous glass tower that scraped the sky over Lake Michigan. The building was the epitome of modern, sterile luxury, a place designed for ghosts and secrets. He led her to a private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse apartment. The space was vast, minimalist, and achingly empty. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic, glittering view of the city and the endless, black expanse of the lake. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a gilded cage, a place so high and isolated it felt completely disconnected from the world below. This was not his home. It was his sanctuary, or perhaps his prison. She stood in the center of the cavernous living room, the city lights painting shifting patterns on the polished concrete floor. The air was still, carrying only the faint scent of old books and clean cold glass. There were no family photos, no personal trinkets, only expensive, impersonal art and shelves of books that looked as though they had never been opened. It was a space curated by a man who did not live but merely existed. The profound loneliness of the apartment seeped into her bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. She felt the invisible walls of her new reality closing in, and the silent, terrified obedience she had clung to for months finally, violently snapped. No. The word was a raw, broken whisper, but it shattered the oppressive silence. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a desperate, defiant fire he had never seen before. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to just take me. You pull me out of my life, put a target on my back, and then you lock me in a tower as if I'm some possession to be protected." Her voice, shaking with a potent cocktail of terror and rage, grew stronger with every word. She was breaking her own most fundamental rule, to be silent, to be invisible, and it felt like she was tearing herself apart. But she could not stop. The injustice of it all, the sheer absolute power he wielded over her existence, was a poison she had to spit out. She took a step toward him, a small, fragile thing challenging a titan. "This is your world, Damien. The violence, the fear, the men in the shadows, that's all you. I was just living my life. I was fine. And now, what am I? A secret you have to hide? A weakness your enemies can use against you?" The questions were accusations, each one a stone she hurled against the fortress of his composure. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a muscle twitching in his jaw, and it spurred her on. For the first time, she wasn't just his son's nanny or a suspected thief. She was a woman whose life had been stolen, and she was demanding he look at the wreckage he had created. He stood perfectly still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He took every word like a bullet, letting them pierce the armor he had spent a lifetime building. He had faced down armed rivals, corrupt politicians, and treacherous allies without flinching, but the raw, righteous fury of this one woman was disarming him completely. Her words were true. He had brought this plague to her doorstep. His darkness had sought her light, and now it threatened to extinguish it. He saw the genuine terror beneath her anger, the trembling of her hands, and felt a surge of self-loathing so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He had sought to protect her, but he had only managed to cage her. As her words trailed off, she was left breathless and shaking, the adrenaline of her outburst replaced by a sudden, bone-deep chill. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against the coldness of the room and her own fear. He moved then, his actions slow, deliberate, as if any sudden motion might shatter her completely. He didn't speak. He simply shrugged off his heavy, dark wool overcoat, the tailored armor of Damien Falcone, the symbol of his power and isolation, and stepped toward her. With an almost reverent gentleness, he draped it over her small, trembling shoulders. It was a gesture so unexpected, so contrary to the man he was, that it felt like a rift opening in the fabric of reality. The coat was impossibly heavy, a physical manifestation of the burden he carried. It enveloped her, smelling of the cold night air, expensive wool, and something that was uniquely him. It was a shield, a comfort, a brand. In that single, silent act, he had transgressed against his own code more profoundly than ever before. He was not commanding or controlling, he was offering. He was giving her his warmth, his protection, his armor, in a silent, desperate confession that words could never convey. He was admitting his guilt, his responsibility, and his terrifying, undeniable need to keep her safe, even from himself. It was not an act of possession, it was an act of surrender. Clara looked up at him, her breath caught in her throat. The anger and fear in her eyes dissolved, replaced by a stunned, dawning understanding. Beneath the cold, dangerous facade of the Mafia boss, she saw the man. She saw the profound, crushing loneliness, the guilt he carried for a task he couldn't outrun, and the raw, aching vulnerability he had just laid bare for her. And he, looking down at her, so small and fierce, wrapped in the coat that was his last line of defense against the world, saw the devastating power of her innocence. She was not his weakness. She was the one thing that made him feel human. And that realization was the most dangerous thing of all. The silence that descended was no longer empty. It was filled with the deafening roar of everything that had just changed between them. The city glittered below, a silent witness to their collision. They stood in the heart of the penthouse, separated by inches, but bound by the weight of a gesture that could never be undone. He had broken his code for her. She had seen the soul of the man behind the monster. There was no path back to what they were. In the stillness, a silent vow had been forged in the space between a monster's guilt and an innocent woman's courage. and the world for both of them had been irrevocably, terrifyingly remade. The morning broke not with light, but with an unnerving stillness. Clara awoke alone in the vast, sterile penthouse, the city a silent, glittering beast beyond the glass walls. Damien was gone. The only evidence he had been there at all was his dark wool overcoat, still draped over the back of a minimalist sofa, a heavy, tangible ghost in the empty room. She walked over to it, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete floor, and touched the fabric. It was still imbued with his scent, a complex mix of the cold night air and a warmth that was uniquely his. The intimacy of the previous night's gesture now felt like a brand, a claim made and then abandoned. She was adrift, suspended between a life that no longer existed and a future she couldn't possibly imagine, a prisoner in a beautiful, lonely sky. Damien returned to his mansion, to the familiar shadows and the suffocating weight of his empire. He moved through the silent halls like a phantom, the armor of his cold composure firmly back in place. But inside, a fault line had fractured his world. He sat in the dark of his study, the security feed of the penthouse playing on a discreet monitor. He watched her pace the room, a small, lost figure dwarfed by the opulence he had imprisoned her in. He saw her touch his coat, and a muscle in his jaw tightened. This feeling, this raw, protective ache in his chest, was a vulnerability he could not afford. His enemies, men who thrive on exploiting weakness, were always watching. Protecting her meant erasing her from his life, a brutal, strategic amputation required for her survival and his. A new life was arranged for her with cold, silent efficiency. She was moved from the penthouse to a high-end, secure apartment in a different part of the city. It was tastefully furnished, fully stocked, and utterly impersonal. Her nursing school tuition was paid for the entire year, and a substantial sum of money appeared in her bank account, a golden leash. She was forbidden from contacting Leo, from returning to the mansion, from having any connection to the Falcone name. The instructions were delivered by a stoic lawyer who never made eye contact. Clara stood at the window of her new cage, watching the rain streak down the glass, each drop a reflection of a tear she refused to shed. She was safe. She was provided for. She had never been more alone. The whispers in the underworld started almost immediately, slithering through the city's dark veins. A rival family, the Morettis, had noticed Falcone's unusual interest in a mere nanny. They began asking quiet questions, probing for a weakness, an angle to exploit. The news reached Damien via a clipped phone call from Marco, and a cold, lethal rage settled in his bones. It was a familiar feeling, but this time it was poisoned with a terrifying, unfamiliar fear. Not for himself, but for her. His transgression in the penthouse, his single moment of human weakness, had placed her in the crosshairs. His order was swift, merciless, and delivered in a voice devoid of all emotion. The inquiries about the nanny were to stop, permanently. Clara tried to immerse herself in her studies, to find solace in the familiar, ordered world of anatomy and pharmacology. She would sit for hours, her textbooks open, but the words were just black marks on the page, unable to penetrate the fog of her thoughts. The moral certainty that had once been her anchor was gone, replaced by a turbulent sea of contradiction. She was living a life funded by violence, protected by a man whose hands were stained with the sins of his world. The sterile comfort of her apartment felt like a betrayal of everything she once believed in. The silence was the loudest sound, a constant reminder of Leo's laughter, of a life she missed with a physical, gut-wrenching ache. The consequences of Damien's order unfolded far from Clara's view, a series of violent, strategic moves that sent a clear, brutal message through the city. A Moretti cargo shipment at the docks was incinerated in an unexplained fire. A key lieutenant was arrested on an old warrant that had been conveniently resurrected. The whispers about the nanny ceased, replaced by a fearful, respectful silence. Damien received the reports in his study, his face an unreadable mask of stone. But as he looked down at his own hands, he felt the invisible stain spread. To protect the one pure thing in his life, he had to become darker, more ruthless, digging the chasm between their two worlds ever deeper, making it utterly impassable. Days bled into a silent, featureless week. Clara's only companion was the relentless ticking of a clock on the wall, each second a small, sharp stab of loneliness. His absence was a palpable entity in the room, a void that pulled at the edges of her sanity. She found herself replaying their last moments together, the weight of his coat on her shoulders, the unguarded pain in his eyes. The memory was a dangerous comfort, a flicker of warmth in the encroaching cold. She had once feared him, resented his power, but now, in the deafening silence he had imposed, she was forced to confront a more terrifying truth. A part of her missed the monster. The pain did not break her. It forged her. One evening, as she watched the city lights ignite one by one, a quiet but unshakable resolve settled over her. The grief for her lost life and the ache of her loneliness finally crystallized into a cold, hard clarity. She was not a victim. She was not a possession to be hidden away. Her integrity, the very quality he had seen in her, was not something he could buy or protect. It was something she had to reclaim for herself. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer her master. She would finish her studies. She would become a nurse. She would build a life so full of her own purpose that his shadow would have no place to fall. Miles away, Damien stood in the now empty penthouse, the space haunted by the ghost of her presence. He had won. The threat was neutralized, she was safe, his world was secure. But the victory tasted of ash. He stared out at the indifferent city, a king surveying a kingdom of glass and light, feeling nothing but a profound, crushing isolation. He had cut her out of his life to save her from his darkness, but in doing so, he had extinguished the only light in his own. He was safe in his fortress, but he was also entombed, left with nothing but the cold, hard memory of a warmth he could never again allow himself to feel. A prolonged, heavy silence fell over two separate lives, bound by an invisible, unbreakable thread. In her quiet apartment, Clara neatly stacked her textbooks on a desk, her movements deliberate and filled with a newfound purpose. She was no longer waiting, she was preparing. Across the city, Damien stood before the vast window of his study, watching the rain begin to fall, the untouched glass of whiskey on the sill reflecting the gray, empty sky. The bond remained, a silent testament to a debt, a transgression, and a shared moment of impossible connection. It was the echo of what they had been, and the deafening silence of what they could now never be. If you were moved by their story, share this with someone who appreciates a tale of impossible love and sacrifice. Like and comment below to let us know your thoughts. 2 years passed, a silent, steady current that carried Clara from the wreckage of her old life to the solid ground of a new one. She was no longer a student, but a pediatric nurse at one of Chicago's most respected hospitals. Tonight, she stood in a grand ballroom for their annual charity gala, a world of glittering chandeliers and soft-spoken philanthropy she now navigated with a quiet confidence. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress, a stark contrast to the drab uniform that had once defined her. Her hair was down, and her smile when it came was genuine. She had built this life for herself, piece by piece, from the ashes of the one he had both destroyed and saved. The fear was a distant echo, a scar that no longer ached. She was, for the first time in a long time, at peace. The evening's host took the stage to announce the benefactor behind the new cardiac wing, a project that would save countless young lives. The donation was the largest in the hospital's history, given by an anonymous entity known only as the Leo Foundation. A polite, appreciative applause rippled through the room, but Clara's heart stopped. Leo. The name was a key, unlocking a door in her memory she had tried so hard to seal shut. Her gaze, almost against her will, began to scan the opulent crowd, searching for a shadow she had convinced herself she would never see again. She told herself it was a coincidence, a cruel trick of fate, but a cold, familiar prickling on the back of her neck told her otherwise. And then she saw him. He was standing near a marble column on the far side of the room, partially obscured by the throng of guests. A moment's parting in the crowd revealed him in his entirety, a figure carved from shadow and stillness, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit. Damien Falcone. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, the formidable control in his posture laced with an almost imperceptible weariness. He was not looking at the stage or the celebrating crowd. His gaze, intense and unwavering, was fixed directly on her. The entire ballroom, with its music and chatter, dissolved into a silent, humming void, leaving only the two of them suspended in the space between. Time held its breath. It was not the gaze of a powerful man observing a former employee, nor that of a protector watching over his charge. It was something more, something achingly human. In his eyes, she saw not possession or command, but a profound, silent acknowledgement. He saw her, not as the frightened girl in his study, but as the woman she had become, standing on her own in a world of light. And she, in turn, saw him, not as the monster she had once feared, but as a man who had found a way to use his darkness to create something good. A man paying a penance she was never meant to know about. There was no love in that look, but there was a universe of shared history, of sacrifice, and of a strange, unbreakable respect. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of release, a farewell, a finality. It said everything that could never be spoken between them. You are safe, you are free, live well. Then, as fluidly as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the crowd, swallowed by the world he commanded. He was gone. Clara stood frozen for a moment longer, a single, silent tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of loss, but of a quiet, painful, and ultimately beautiful closure. The debt had been paid. The story, their story, was finally over. She took a deep, steadying breath, the first truly free breath she had taken in 2 years. His redemption was never meant for the world to see. It was a silent conversation between his soul and her memory. And her strength was not born from his absence, but forged in the fire of his presence. Some bonds are not meant for this world, existing only in a quiet nod, an anonymous act of grace, a final, shared look that says more than a lifetime of words. This is the kind of story that reminds us that even in the deepest darkness, a soul can still reach for the light. If their journey has moved you, share this story so others can experience it, and subscribe for more tales of profound human connection. Like this video and tell us in the comments what you believe that final, silent nod truly meant.